Broadcasting. Hello, welcome. Digital Roundtable is on. It is Wednesday, March 24th, 2021. It is almost Christmas, feels like. I mean, what happened to 2020? It's already April. Oh my God. It's going too fast for me. You can see that it's a beautiful day in the capital of Texas. And here we go. Dr. John Sibley Butler and his guitar is ready. John, let's roll.
Photographs and memories, Christmas cards you sent to me, all that I have are these to remember you.
Nice, nice. Thank you, Johnny. How are you doing today?
I'm doing just fine in a great city. I woke up this morning and realized that there's a PGA golf tournament going on down from the house. Lots of cars, lots of individuals, and it's a great city in Austin, Texas. But I looked at the New York Times this morning, and the headlining was "Bucking the Pandemic. Austin is the hottest market in the country." We want to make sure that Llewelyn sees this. Llewelyn, can you see this? I just need to remind Llewelyn that Texas created 5 times the amount of jobs than any state in the union, and that also Texas, despite the snowstorm, despite the pandemic,
I don't want to disillusion you, Gavin.
It is facts. The hottest place in the world. We've got everybody coming here. As David Crockett said, y'all can all go to hell. I'm going to Texas. So my point is, I think that it's a great day. And of course, I call this the city that George Kosmeski built. We've done a great job, but I was elated to see this headline. Isn't it interesting how we are coming out of the pandemic, both mentally and economically? Isn't it interesting how as the stock market looks like it's going down a little bit and interest rates are going up, and there's some uncertainty. So Andreas, I'm doing great in the great city of Austin. We're hosting a PGA tournament here, and Jordan Speak won his first round competition. So I'm just feeling good. Thank you.
Excellent. Llewelyn, how are you today?
I'm very well. I hate to break into John's train of fantasy, his happy fairy stories. As I understand it, Austin is building up a huge problem of a giant influx of people on an infrastructure that cannot accommodate them, so that you have tremendous inflation in the housing market and huge pressure on people who don't have a lot of money, because the Texas economy hasn't been as generous to them as it has been to some. This is the problem of too much tiger growth, what they called when it happened to Ireland, tiger growth. A little steady growth is probably far superior for the people, except for 1 or 2 speculators. I assume John is one of those because of his general happy demeanor as the money rolls in. It's amazing how that happens. It's a powerful narcotic, isn't it, Johnny?
Well, in Texas, we glorify those people who do. So
I beg your pardon?
We glorify wealth in Texas, and
indubitably you do. But wealth, it depends on what wealth is built on. Yes. Otherwise, you end up with a crisis situation, which is actually something that's very interesting that's happening. And that is, I mentioned before we went on there briefly, this idea of the Great Reset, which came out of Davos, and Klaus, whatever his name is there, the founder of the Davos Economic Forum in 1971. And he has suggested that it's time for a Great Reset. Along comes a proposal drifting around, not yet defined, but in the trial balloon stage from the Biden administration, suggesting a $3 trillion reset in which we will fix education, we will fix healthcare, and we will fix the infrastructure. And you know what? It's easy to puncture it, it's easy to attack it, but it's awfully exciting. It is the possibility of something gigantic happening, maybe the biggest thing that's happened since the New Deal. If it can be pulled off, if there isn't too great a waste of money, and if it is accompanied, and this is the great essential underwriting reality, by an eventual increase in productivity to service the debt which will be incurred.
Yep. Yep. Awesome. Awesome. Well, we have a great guest speaker today. His name is David Heitzer, and I'm just going to say hi to him real quick before I introduce him. David, how are you, sir?
I'm very well, Andres. How are you doing?
Good. I'm really good. I'm excited that you're joining us. Where are you today physically?
I'm in Houston, Texas.
Houston, Texas.
But I will say I'm not going to get in the middle of those other two. I'm telling you that's going back and forth too much for me.
Hey, all I have to say is that you live in the city named after Sam Houston. It was the first capital of Texas. And Sam Houston was so visionary that he decided, after becoming an independent country before joining the Union, that he wanted the economy of Texas to diversify. So he handpicked one of his best lieutenants, Stephen S. Austin, and told him to go to this little city called Waterloo, Texas, and move the capital there. Think about that. That's amazing. Texans are very visionary. So anyway, glad that you're here with us, David. David is the head of business origination for retail and wholesale renewable energy at EDF North America. And he's been in the industry a long time. EDF, if you know, is really Electricité de France. And they happen to speak English and have a North America division. As part of being the largest energy company, one of the largest energy companies of the world, if not the largest. I think NG and EDF are neck and neck, and then there are a couple of others that are fairly close. Prior to his work with EDF, David had been in the industry for a long time. He was with Reliant Energy, and he there had all kinds of responsibilities. And then before that, he worked at a company called Parsons Corporation. And David happens to be a Longhorn. He went to the University of Texas for an MBA at McCombs School. And we won't hold this against him. He actually grew up in East Texas and went to the University of Delaware, where he graduated as a chemical engineer in East Texas. Welcome, wow. David.
Thanks for that intro.
I'm so glad you grew up in East Texas. You have an interest for perspective of the world, just like Llewelyn. Anyway, what's been going on the last 7 days is it seems like the vaccinations are coming at a pace of 17 million a week, which is great. Hopefully it'll climb to 20 or so. I understand that there is a bogey where every American should be vaccinated by the end of May. That looks very doable, given the pace that we're having. It looks like the death and the cases of COVID are stabilizing, slightly trending down. Things are not, there's no major flares anywhere. There doesn't seem to be a resurgence after spring break yet. Even though it's too early to tell, but hopefully things will continue to stabilize and hopefully everybody will be vaccinated by the end of the summer. So all those things are good. There seems to be a lot of worry about inflation, primarily due to the price of oil, which last week came down quite a bit. The prior week had raised quite a bit. So it came down $3.75 compared to last week for crude oil. Price of gas slightly came down in Greater Austin, 9 cents. And that, tells me that things are, trading sideways, kind of settling. The stock market is trading sideways. Everybody's kind of watching what's going on with all this $1.9 trillion and the great reset of 3 trillion and all that, and lots of uncertainty about how this comes about and how it gets rolled out, but it looks very promising to me. So anyway, I wanted to get your feedback, David. You've probably heard some of our prior shows. What's your take in your job today in the sphere that you move in? What has been the impact of COVID? Is the business being impacted at all? Slowed down? Has it accelerated? We talked about COVID as a digitalization force, accelerating the need for more automation and more technology so people don't talk to each other, touch each other, the whole Zoom thing. I suspect that you have weekly Zoom calls with everybody in the world. Tell us what has COVID done for you guys? How have you guys adjusted to it? Anything we could learn from?
Sure. I think at a very 10,000 foot level, I think it's important to think about the amount of power being used. Most people thought that COVID would have affected power usage, but actually power usage has maintained at the same level this year over last year, 2020 over 2019. I think that's really important. But when you go a little deeper into it, you find out that your big box retail, your towers, commercial towers are not using as much, but your industrials and your residentials are using more, which is exactly what you're talking about. So from the power industry, we really have not seen that much loss of use as far as megawatt hours. So that, I think that's kind of interesting. From a tactical standpoint, we've been working basically remote. However, the real-time desks and all the trading desks have to be there in place because they're dealing with, scheduling and trading for megawatt hours gas for power plants. And that's critical that their operation is on site and all together. But people like me, I'm called a non-essential employee, which is upsetting to me because I don't believe I'm not essential, but I am. And I've been dealing with my customers. Travel's been limited very much as far as going to see customers, which I think is something that the business traveler will start going on a plane again. And we're starting to see that, as you can imagine. But I do think a lot of meetings will be done on Zoom and on Teams. We use Teams, and that's been a big rollout for us. And I think that's here to stay. So I think what I'm seeing mostly and in my industry is the hybrid, which I think we're seeing everywhere. It's not going to go back to the way it was, but it's not going to stay the way it is. And that's where I think we're going to end up.
Yeah. Llewelyn?
Well, I was interested, David, that you said that the demand for electricity has been fairly constant. At the beginning of the pandemic, and I've not checked lately, EEI said it was off 5.6% across the board, which would seem reasonable with some reduced economic activity. However, manufacturing is up, commodities are in short supply, steel is going through the roof, as are other basic commodities. There's a lot of economic activity. I think the challenge, and I think the administration recognizes it, whether it can satisfy it is something else, is to try to spread the prosperity. I would like to see big changes made to education. I'd like to see us create maybe a whole new thing, which is, I call it construction and repair, a new degree. You chaps are at a university in which we teach people to do the work that is needed, not the work that professors like to teach. I've said this on this program before, but you can't leave school and start a sociology factory. You can't leave school and sell history on the street corner, but you can if you're a plumber, if you're a carpenter, if you're a drywall person. We need to increase the dignity of those occupations, because while we're going to lose work for the totally unskilled or for the semi-skilled or for the pickup worker who maybe works in a restaurant or something like that, their future is grim. But if you have a skill, if you can fix something, if you can cut stone, plaster, do anything like that, your future is quite good. The problem is that we have become obsessed with pushing people through college, and we've developed a whole set of soft courses where people who don't have the need for college are nonetheless in college. And I include among those courses, by the way, journalism. I've always thought if you want to be a journalist, you better go down to a newspaper and start. You're not going to learn how to do it in a university. However, there are plenty of people going through universities, and now they're going through it at a tremendous rate with no jobs in sight whatsoever. So it's dishonest to educate them for something in which they cannot work. And I indict much of the university system for that. I like the idea of looking at universities in terms of the need of the country for what is coming up. Clearly, computer sciences, any of the hard sciences, we need more of those graduates, and the universities churn them out very successfully. When we come to the liberal arts, the soft sciences, the things that actually interest me, the universities really fail the society by teaching not very talented people not very important skills.
Thank you. Thank you. Johnny?
Yeah, I think it's very, very interesting, David, that you talked about the changes in what we would do. And from a managerial, psychological, sociology point of view, which is all come together for management, for the handling of people. I'm thinking about, if I look at all of the people that we interviewed, for example, at the University of Texas, we need to start thinking about, and I've mentioned this in management, what goes with Llewelyn is saying, a degree that looks at management and management in the digital era. That is, we won't just be managing people, we're managing platforms, we're managing things. As Drucker, the greatest management thinker ever, along with Schumpeter, would say.
May I mention that I knew Drucker?
Well, I've read everything he has written. And
have you read his autobiography, which is very funny? It's called Confessions of a Bystander, and it's largely about hanky-panky in Europe, and then in London, and then in New York. But he seemed to know everyone. Do you know that Luce wanted him to be the editor of Life magazine? Incredible.
Well, he was a critic and he was a great thinker. I think he's the greatest management thinker that we've had. But what we need to do, I think, first of all, is to understand David's point. If the business model is going to change, and again, if we connect that back to the university, or to any kind of schooling now. Schooling is everywhere. You know, I play classic guitar and I learned most of it on the internet now. But we really have to look at this gap between industry now and where we're going. So I'm very interested in his comments on how would you bring somebody to your firm now that has been taught traditional in a traditional business school? One of the things that's happening from an academic point of view is that the physicists are taking over finance. They're writing the equations. We have big data. The physicists are becoming social scientists because they take the big data and write the equation about the movement of people. So I see a big convergence in terms of academic disciplines, what I call going back to the core disciplines. So I'm wondering out loud, as we move forward, and David, we've talked about the different kinds of changes for business models. What would a manager look like in the future? Will there be someone who can manage a company that's on a deck, or somebody that's on a platform? Will it be someone who can manage someone that they've never seen? And in terms of the majors, you know, I taught in China, taught in Japan. What impressed me about China was 70% of the people were majoring in the sciences, and 70% of our people majoring in business. And we know that science itself is really what changes the business models. So I just want to ask Dave, what do you think about the new manager of the future? If Drucker were alive today, and he looked at how technology has changed how we relate to each other, how my students walk around looking just at their telephones now. And when we go to work, people tend to isolate themselves along with their cell phones rather than interact with each other. So David, I want you to be a Drucker of today and talk to me about how would you design a management degree, if you will, for the new managers that combines the digital stuff with the really people stuff.
Wow. Great question. John, I think the way I would look at that is, I think you need the combination. And similar to my comment about a hybrid, I think you do need somebody who has the science and technology background and understanding of the sciences. But I do also think that they need to have the social science skill set and the interrelationship skills to deal with people. Because at the end of the day, if you can't deal with people, nothing's going to happen. You can get certain things done. You can outsource and certain things overseas or in different areas. But at the end of the day, you still have to interact with people. You have to motivate people. And that is a people skill. So I don't think we can go too far and think that people are robots and people will do what you tell them. They don't. They're going to seek something. I mean, one of the things that we see now, and I'm sure you've seen at the schools, is my generation, your generation is so different than the current generations, and how they think and what they want and what they see as important in an organization, whether it's a startup or whether it's a 200,000 person company. So to me, I think those skill sets of interpersonal skills, along with financial and technical skills, is the manager of the future. So I would profess that we need to train people in those core skills, but also make sure that they can deal with people. And I think that's important.
I think that's good. I'm sorry.
No, but I was going to say, so David, do you see the value of internships, hands-on work experience being more important today than ever before for that person to really learn to grasp and study and apply and learn in a better way? Do we?
Absolutely. I think there's no more important part of your education, for whether it's 4 years, 5 years, or 8 years, is to get hands-on experience in the areas you want. One reason is obvious. Do you like what you're doing? To me, if you're not passionate about what you're doing, you shouldn't do it. So I think that gives you one thing, is that you can learn about an industry, a field, a company, and with a hands-on experience. And also, I just think it's so important to understand what they don't teach you in a book, which is probably more important than anything that you could learn from that book, because those companies and how they work and how things actually get done is not what's taught. And we see that all the time. When you're dealing with, a crisis, that's when interpersonal skills also become so much more important. When things are simple, you can program it. When they're not, you need people.
Yeah. So real quick, David, as I roll down through our areas of focus, clearly, automation is the core activity around digitalization. And you are in an industry that more and more is, opening and welcoming to the, more granular degrees of automation. And so, you guys are trading billions of dollars on a yearly basis, hundreds of billions perhaps. And this is all goes back to, some kind of power facility, a solar farm, and, and ultimately somebody needs to manage that, and somebody's tracking what's going on there, and connectivity to make sure that that's happening is very important. So tell me your perspective on fiber, the broadband proliferation, technologies like 5G coming to bear. How important is connectivity to the future of managing assets, of dispatching those assets, of maintaining those assets? What do you think is happening here, and how important is it to the energy space?
It is very, very important, Andres. I think the main things, as you're talking about, as far as the maintenance, getting preventive maintenance, getting getting the information feedback for doing repairs ahead of time, getting information that you've got a problem as far as different flows, whether it's gas, whether it's power. I just think all of those things are so important, but I think even more so, the power industry is probably one of those that's going to just evolve so much over the next 5 years. If you think about the changes that are occurring from centralized to decentralized, you just need so much more information flow back and forth to make sure that you have reliability. You also need to know when you have a fossil fuel, whether it's coal, nuke, or a natural gas facility versus a solar farm or a wind farm, you can't count on it, a wind farm or a solar farm. So you need to have so much better information to make sure that you are getting power, because people in their homes, people in businesses, they just want to turn on the light switch. They really don't want to think about it. People talk a good game that they really want more, but at the end of the day, most people just want power to flow and not worry about it. And when they have an interruption, it's a big problem.
Time out. Hold the presses. Hold the presses. You just popped my balloon, David. You're saying that I cannot run all of Texas with wind and solar?
No, you cannot.
Oh.
No, it cannot be done. I do think that you need a certain amount of fossil fuels, dispatchable generation, they call it, because there's no way you can count on the wind and solar unless we can get a lot of big batteries to make up for when things are not running smoothly on the renewables.
Yeah. Llewelyn, you had a question?
Well, yes. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Johnny on his superb question, which really brought everything into play. And I have hardly a hint of criticism of his implied answer to his own question. But I was wondering, how does EDF feel these days? When I first started writing about EDF a very long time ago, it was the nuclear company of the world because France Framatome built them and EDF operated them, and they were going on a straight nuclear course. They had Phoenix, and they were going to build super Phoenix, and there was going to be fast reactors, and they were going to show the world before actually global warming was the consideration that it is today. And now it seems to have lost its sense of that nuclear mission and to become a general utility, more politically influenced than it was traditionally. Would that be a reasonable thing to conclude?
I can't speak to the corporate philosophy, but they still are running those nuclear plants in France. I do believe it's still about 80 or 90% is nuke. So, but what they've done is expanded into other geographies, and the other geographies for different reasons are not wanting as much nuclear for political reasons, for environmental reasons, and for cost reasons. So I do, and you also have, if you have a lot of natural gas, you can build a natural gas facility. If you have a lot of coal, even though environmentally unfriendly, it still allows you to produce the lowest price power available. And then you also, with nuclear, you have the spent reactive materials, which still is a problem. And one of the things people say, well, it's non-carbon, but you still have an environmental issue with nukes. And I think that also plays into that, because no one wants that spent waste in their backyard.
I'd like to go back to the issue which both of you spoke so brilliantly to, of management, except there is a paradox. In the early days of the creation of a new institution, and we saw it in Silicon Valley, it's almost chaotic. Management is not present in the normal sense of management, and certainly not in Peter Drucker's sense of it, as in his study of Albert Sloan and General Motors. The chaos is part of the creative process, and at some point that levels off, there's a plateau, more traditional management comes into bear, and you can't go on like that. The other part of the paradox is the enormous influence, often contrary to management theory, of the individual, whether it was Rickover or Rupert Murdoch or any of these basically larger than life people who interest me, who there's a book that Erwin Stelzer wrote. I don't know if it was published as a book, I think it was, on Murdoch and his management style, which is really contrary to all management. It's almost being a guerrilla chief in your own corporation, which has worked extraordinarily well. It's given that organization a nimbleness which it would not have had otherwise. I think the one thing that was missing in Drucker's analysis, at least my reading of it, is it didn't allow for creative tension, and it didn't allow for the kind of nimbleness that modern business requires, which is often associated more with individual vision than with good sense.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I am very impressed with your sociological analysis of Drucker.
I'm very frightened when you're impressed.
But George Kosmetsky, in his book, Creative and Innovative Management, this is what we've always understood. And I'm speaking right from IC Square and what we did at IC Square under George Kosmetsky. Look, we know that we need creative individuals. For example, Brazavois, that came out of the University of Texas, he would say, I don't know when your vacation is. You take it as long as the numbers are correct. John Mackey with Whole Foods said that all right, every person, every unit will manage their own unit and hire and fire in that unit. Then there are people who are saying, okay, you stay home. I really don't care what you do as long as the results are there. But as David said, at the center of economic change that's brought on by this digital revolution, you must still inspire people. And if you can read Sloan's book on how I built General Motors, that's about all you need. What changes is the technology itself and how it applies. I can say that as a professor. So in my class, the laptops are wide open. I used to say, can anybody remember what Sloan did to General Motors in whatever? Look it up now. We don't have to wait to go to the library. Right. It's the same way in business. And we need innovative, creative managers. Drucker would always say that if you hand your firm to a manager, traditionally, the management would kill it because they don't want to take risks. So as David would say, we are in a very interesting time for the interaction between business going forward in America, innovation, and how we manage these things, especially electricity. And David, je parle beaucoup le français, ma grand-mère est français, s'il vous plaît. That was my grandmother français, my grandmother was French, so I could speak the language and parlay. There's a little Louisiana in there with a southern accent. But I think it's very, very interesting, and these are great times for us to think about these things because of the international competition. I'm going to say that again, because of the international competition. We can no longer assume that America will be the leaders of the world. The Chinese and 5D and all the other technology that's going on, what they're doing in Germany, what's happening around the world, it will be a very interesting, connected world.
Yeah. Let me pause real quick. And take us to our quick break to promote our annual event is coming up, 2021 edition, August 31st, September 1st and 2nd. It's a face-to-face meeting for sure. We're expecting all of you gentlemen to be there, plus many more, and looking forward to seeing you. And these are, thank you again to all the companies that I spoke in August of 2020. And thanks again to the University of Texas State for sponsoring the Digital Roundtable. Now, let me come back and let me cut to the chase on the most important topic that everybody wants to hear about from David. David, and I know that, we're not really expecting any formal opinion from EDF on this, but your insights. You've been in this business a long time. I side paraphrase the what happened in Texas during the snowstorm in my tweets, and propose an answer of moving to 8 microgrid balancing authorities. They had to have the ability to get hardened on their own so that one grid doesn't tumble the others. We have talked about, briefly weatherization. And what I say to people is ERCOT did what it could. It could have prepared better, but when a storm happened, when the events happened, it prevented the blackout and the system performed as designed. Now, we have, I think, all realized, this is my own personal opinion, that the system is flawed and it has some flaws on the technology side, but even more important, it has some flaws on the pricing side. What's your take on what has happened, and what do you offer as suggestions of what to fix?
Well, as we know, there's probably $3.2 billion of bankruptcies as of right now. Probably there's going to be more in the future, with certain retailers not making it in the future. But the $9,000 cap, which is the system-wide offer cap for power in an hour, the problem with that is it was supposed to incentivize people to build generation. But what it did in this case is did not incentivize anybody to build anything, because you can't build a $1 billion power facility based on once every 10 years getting a week of $9,000, and you don't know when it's going to happen. So it was supposed to incentivize higher prices, but what it did was cause a disruption in the entire market, a disruption with a lot of the municipalities, and they can't handle this. So it doesn't do what it was supposed to do. Do I think we need to go to a capacity and energy market like PJM, which is up in Pennsylvania or California? No, I don't. I think the energy only market does work, but you have to have the right incentives to make sure that you get the generation that you need when you need it. And you promote what you actually want to happen, which is build reliable generation and reward people that are filling in those gaps when you might have scarcity. But you don't need to pay for generation that you don't need 95% of the time and pay them all the time. What you need is just to make sure that you have a reliable grid at a reasonable price, because the reasonable price is important, because that's how you generate business to come down here.
Right.
Because it's very important.
Now, you in particular, EDF has its hands on two sides of the market. Yeah, you guys trade kilowatt hours, and you guys trade BTUs on the gas side. And as we know, David, and maybe you can elaborate on this, the electricity market is regulated in price, but the gas market is not, is a commodity. Is there a way to make this thing work? Or what does this look like 10 years from now?
That's a great question. I do think that we're going to get more and more decentralization, where people are going to take more control of their power facilities and their natural gas pricing. I think that's one thing. I think it's the decentralization will allow for more new products. I do think people are going to be using some of the technologies of batteries, whether it's for an electric vehicle or for their house, or they're going to put a gas facility, and that's on the residential side. But I believe the retail people are going to do the exact same thing. I just don't think this one behemoth, big structure is the way of the future. You don't see this in some of the other countries that are just starting, that didn't start with a centralized facility. They're starting with decentralization, and that's the way they're going to grow. They're going to skip that step. So that's how I think the future is. And I do think that the power and natural gas is going to be, I think people are just going to change how they do things. and it's going to become more self-sufficient, as
Yeah.
opposed to wondering what's going to happen in the natural gas in West Texas if I'm living in Houston.
Right.
David, let me ask you this. Let's take this as a finance question. And let's ask another kind of question. So we have energy coming from different sources. But we also have the data to be able to somehow to predict the future. So if we look at the Black-Scholes model, for example, in finance, or the efficient model in finance, we know that it's very, very difficult to predict the future, because as we invest, we say that past performance does not indicate future performances. But given where we are now with the grid, I would say that we have the data. If we change some of the grid controls, the edge grid controls, to produce models which would allow us to predict as well as we can what might happen in the future. And so therefore, we're not at the control of nature per se. And we know that the signal and the noise or the prediction is what we do, whether it's weather, whether it's finance, or whatever have you. So do you think that now we have the information, we can create the controls on the grid to create a predictive model to understand where the energy is coming from coal, where the energy is coming from other kinds of sources, and bring it all together and say, this is what this city needs, and this is what this city needs, or this is what this area needs. And in that way, you have a predictive model. But I think that does presuppose that you're not at the deregulated model in terms of the mathematics, but you're in a situation where you have so much data, like finance, you can almost predict what might happen to the future at a 0.05 level.
John, I think your comment is valuable in the sense that it's very insightful. I do think it could work. The problem is that power is critical, and you can't store it for the most part economically right now. And the ramifications of a mistake is catastrophic. And that's what we saw during the freeze. And that's why it's a little different than, for example, you could invest so much money in the power grid that we would never have a problem, but it would be so expensive, it wouldn't be beneficial. So I use the analogy, it's not a great one. What is the reason that we don't put fire sprinklers in our houses? It would solve the problem if there was a fire, but no one does it because it's too expensive. And if the sprinklers go off, they would destroy your house and you would have to do a major reno. The same way is we can't put enough controls and enough insurance to make sure that we don't have a problem. What we have to do is create an environment so that we are able to have a problem and get through it that minimizes the catastrophic events that could occur. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's like the weather. Whatever we do, we cannot.
That's right. It's got to be flexible as opposed to, we're going to do this model this way all the time, because it's just not going to work. Not in the power business.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Hey, store it.
David,
you cannot store it. I mean, when you
that is the problem.
You have to use it.
David, real quick, before I forget, there is another commodity that it's looming, maybe coming, and I want your sense on it. Maybe it's not going to happen in your lifetime, don't know, but I'm curious what you think. It's called hydrogen. There is gray hydrogen already happening between Texas and Louisiana every day at big scale. It's used in the petrochemical industry. You're a chemical engineer. And there's a big talk about green hydrogen, right? And this all has to do with what kind of fuel are you using to create it? Do you see a day with you're trading hydrogen?
I do. Hydrogen is coming on strong right now. California is probably the leader with the low carbon fuel standard, but they've incentivized people to produce green hydrogen. And I do think a lot of the cities are going to look at it and say, you know what, if it's safe, we will run our cars on green hydrogen, but you need the infrastructure. But as you know, with natural gas, you can possibly use some of that same infrastructure. So yes, I think hydrogen in the future, and a lot of your industrial gas suppliers, your Air Products, your Linde, your Messer, your all of Air Liquide, all of them are getting into hydrogen in a very big way and on the forefront of some of the new technologies. One of the things that innovation from the universities is going to have to come from is they've got to make it, and they've got to make it in the amounts that we need. Right now, they're limited in the size and the number of cubic feet that they can produce.
Right, right.
Can I ask, David, you said implied that hydrogen would be used for transportation. I had the general impression in my reporting that it would be used for electric production, in fact, a de facto kind of storage, and that outside of very large trucks where you don't want the weight penalty of big batteries, transportation is going to EVs. Would that be a reasonable interpretation, or do you think we're going to see a surge? It seems to me that prima facie, talking about the costs, that if you're going to build a dual system to vend hydrogen and vend electricity for the motorists, that was going to be enormously expensive and confusing.
Well, and I would say, in my opinion, I do think it's going to be a very controlled environment on where you put the hydrogen transportation. Similar to what you just said, it's going to be on fleets, it's going to be cities, it's going to be truckers, it's going to be in a specific area, so they don't have to worry about refueling at the Buc-ee's down the street. It's going to be much more of buses would be another, school buses would be another area for hydrogen, where it's a very controlled, where you drive all day, you load up with the hydrogen, you drive the next day, but you're not having to deal with the infrastructure issues that you're discussing. I think that would be my area that I think it could work very well. And then you get the minimizing, one of the misnomers in my mind of electric vehicles is that the power that's going into that electricity for that vehicle is being powered by coal and natural gas, whereas hydrogen would be a much cleaner fuel as compared to those. The other thing with batteries, as you know, with some of the chemicals that go into them, that's another issue with what to do with those. So I do think hydrogen has a place in this clean green world that we're looking for, but it's limited and very focused in certain areas.
If you're trading or doing risk analysis, do you count the rarity of rare earths and the Chinese dominance in the rare earth supply so essential to windmills and in fact to all modern appliances, but the great multiplier that is rare earths, do you count that as one of the risks you calculate in?
Absolutely. I think that, and I do think the administration is aware of it. I think the battery manufacturers are aware of it, and they're starting to do certain things domestically in the United States to alleviate that issue, because we don't want another, pardon my history, but we don't want another OPEC situation of the 70s, which it could occur.
Right. David, real quick, do you see a day, and we got still 10 minutes, do you see a day where it is possible to trade on carbon? It's probably, has an element of being an equitable equalizer on many fronts. It would be highly disruptive, but do you see that? I mean, clearly we do some regional trading in Philadelphia with Reggie. It's traded in the UK. What's your take on it as a commodities trader in energy?
I actually think that it's probably the best way, because to me, it allows for the market forces to determine what is green, what is not green, what should be produced. It puts a cost on the carbon. The question would always be are you putting the right cost on each carbon effluent. So that would be my concern. But whether you're making something that is coal driven or natural gas or hydrogen, it, as opposed to using renewables, I just think it allows for market forces. I do believe the Biden administration is looking at it. They also see it as a very good way or an easy way to collect money. And that would be another driver for this, for them to do it, because they could drive their whole green initiative with a carbon tax. But the key would be is you don't want the carbon tax to make us uncompetitive or non-competitive in the global marketplace. As we said at the onset of this conversation, it is a global market. So when you're making polyethylene, you got to make sure that your polyethylene can stand up to the Chinese facilities, and you want to make sure that you are competitive, if not lower cost.
David, let's go back to the EVs. In China, there are 400 companies making EVs. I'm predicting in America, there'll be at least 350 to 500 companies creating EVs. That is, they only have 4 or 5 really great parts. You can 3D print the body and just put everything that's in. What do you think, if my projections are true, that we go up to 500 General Motors, quote unquote, producing EVs? And when you plug a car into the electrical socket, if you will, it's like plugging a house into an electrical socket. So we can create a model that says we're going to have 500 makers of EVs in America. What does that do to the grid?
Wow, this is like a layup for Andres. This is what he's been talking about since his days at Austin Energy. It's going to change the marketplace. The other thing I would say is, on the other side, you now have a storage facility of hundreds of thousands of megawatt hours that you can send back to the grid at any time. In a sense, you have a power plant in those EV batteries. So to me, that is why it's so important that you don't have I'll call it brick and solid infrastructure, but a very flexible trading infrastructure, and so that the electrons can flow where they're needed. But to me, you could incentivize people not to, fill their, quote unquote, fill their car between 3 and 9 p.m. And then basically between 3 and 9 p.m., you have power plants ready to go when you need them, which would solve the whole issue of the scarcity and the pricing issues.
Right.
Andres, do you want to add anything? Because I know this is
No, I mean,
near to your heart.
I think that, we track decentralization and decarbonization and digitalization, and those 3 trends are highly producing this hybrid reality where the edge of the grid, it becomes a reality, just like personal computers and personal networks became a reality versus the mainframes in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and so on. I was going to ask you something that dovetails into that. So there is a term in the industry that we actually coined in 2011 called virtual power plants. And this is, from the old days at Austin Energy. And virtual power plants, as you know, is the whole integration of the supply and the demand being managed on a real-time basis. As a trading expert, do you see a day where FERC Order 841, FERC Order 2222, aggregators of load on the edge of the grid, playing in the wholesale market? Do you see that coming? Is that going to happen, David?
I would hope so, but there are some strong issues with it going forward, and those are the legacy utilities. It's not in their best interest, and they have a business that they're trying to run. I mean, as we saw in Texas back in 2000, when we went to deregulation, certain companies had to change. They either split up, became, I call them poles and wires, and the deregulated part was separated. Other companies stayed together with, so I do think, yes, but there's going to be a lot of political issues with moving that forward. But I do think that it will happen because technology is going to drive it to happen. And one of the things that we didn't mention about the pandemic, and John, you mentioned this early on, was just the idea that everything that was a trend in the power and energy business, the pandemic actually, I call it, put it on steroids. It just occurred that much quicker. And everything that was a trend is now a reality. And everything that was going the other way went the other way.
Right.
So, like, for example, a lot of the renewables are doing extremely well, but certain parts of them are not going to be happening anymore. You're not going to put a virtual facility in Oklahoma if you need the power in Texas, because it doesn't do you any good.
Mhm.
You want that to be in
Co-located.
sync with your overall business.
Yeah.
And those are kind of things that are happening. It's becoming a much more physical business. And I just think it's going to be good. And what Andres is talking about is even more so that way. Whereas if you have excess power, you'll sell it to your neighbor. And
Okay.
that neighbor could be a refiner selling it to a chemical plant because that company has more than they need.
Yeah.
And that's where things will be going.
Yeah.
As you said earlier, we just want the lights to come on. People really haven't thought about deeply where it comes from. We haven't thought about the different models. The only thing I want to do is turn my light switch on and let the
That's
light.
correct.
Yeah.
But right now, for the first time, can you imagine? I cannot remember one presidential debate that was about electricity. Not one since I've been alive. Not one about the grid. Not one. I bet that'll change.
Yeah, it will. But I don't think I think it's the thing that I've always told Andres, and my viewpoint is very much that it's got to be simple. It just has to be, it can't be complicated. And I do believe with technology, they can make it simple. And that's why all these technologies have just gone crazy during this pandemic, because it's simple, people use them, and they can see the benefits and the value. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Do you, David, see a day then where transactive energy and folks have the ability at the retail level, just like it happens in the wholesale level, and we take it for granted, where I can give my excess capacity from my solar rooftop to John as a payment for him bidding me off course? Do you see that happening? Is that going to happen?
Well, is he going to pay with Bitcoin also? Can we just add it all together? I think that's pretty far off. I really do. I think it's going to be much more to make it worthwhile. It's going to be on the larger users or the aggregators. And that would be the other way to go, is with the aggregators. As opposed to you and John doing a deal, I, as an aggregator, will put all these things together and make it work.
Yeah. So given that, and your comment about the utility, the establishment getting in the way of this future happening, I know for a fact, and I'm sure you do as well, that there are a few companies that have at the FERC level wholesale access to the markets for energy purchases, and they do it today for their own. Walmart, Google, Microsoft, eBay, all these guys, Amazon. Do you guys potentially see a thread down the road where Amazon or Google or one of these guys is going to become an energy provider? Could that happen?
I don't. I do think potentially Amazon is a potential, but I don't see some of the others because the business itself is very complicated. It's really a billing, job when you get down to it. The scheduling is fairly reasonable because you're doing it on an aggregate basis, but it's really invoicing and customers, and that's more of an Amazon than a Microsoft. So I don't think, but I do think they could be aggregators of renewable power because they want to promote it, and they could become suppliers of that in the future.
Got it.
But I don't see them becoming retailers other than someone like Amazon, who is already in your house, already doing things, and could very easily turn your thermostat off and on for different reasons. So there's a logic there.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Well, gentlemen, any last questions for David?
My question has more or less been answered, and that is, what new players will we see in the electric space? Electric utilities traditionally have had huge cash flow. That must be very tempting to people looking across the whole board of economic opportunity. And they're very set in their ways. They're not very traditionally entrepreneurial. They take their pride not in their bottom line as much as they do in keeping the lights on, which they do rather well. And an adjacent question is, what are we going to do about resilience? How can we have an interconnected world with smart cities if every time the wind blows, we're told to take the stuff out of the refrigerator and buy batteries?
I think you've hit the key point here, and I don't believe that things are going to change because of the reliability and resilience issue. You just can't go there from the standpoint of it's too important to have the reliability, and because, as John mentioned, you can't store it for the most part, at least economically, it just cannot change that quickly. So I do believe that it's in this interconnected world, we're not going to change that much, but I think the efficiency is going to be that much better. One of the key examples I always mentioned back in my Reliant days, the load factor, the idea of how much does a power plant actually run during a year. The average power plant runs 40% of the time. You can't build a chemical plant and run it 40% of the time and make money. So I do think with storage, with batteries, with things like that, we can make a much more efficient electricity market and make it so that it works that much better, but still reliable.
Right.
David,
thank you very much. We are out of time. We could stay here for hours talking to you. It's been a pleasure. I want to thank you for joining us today. Gentlemen, want to thank David for us too.
Thank you very much, David.
absolutely, David. Fascinating. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you, gentlemen, for having me, and I really enjoyed it. You made me think on my feet, which is always enjoyable, and your banter between the two of you on the bottom part of this screen is classic, and I wouldn't have wanted to miss it.
We aim to please.
Johnny, take us away on the guitar.
Okay. If you get the feeling all alone, when your good time friends have all got up and gone, please don't come knocking around my door, because I've heard your lies before. There ain't gonna be a next time, this time, starting right now. I'm gonna forget your name and your pretty face, write you off as a bad mistake, you know that. Some women, they are lovely, and some just don't have sense. But a woman like you ought to be ashamed of the things that you do to men.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Well
take care.
done, Johnny. Well done. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Say, Bo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
You remember I